Mustafa,
Hi, Robert.
how you doing?
Thanks. It's pretty good. And it's a, rainy day in Istanbul, but things are fine. Thanks for asking. How are you?
I'm not doing too bad. It's finally quit raining here, actually. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is an episode of Worldwise, and you are Mustafa Akyol. And you are, as you said, in Istanbul. You're a journalist. You're a columnist for two of the papers there, right? One is the Star, and the other one, although I saw it when I was in Istanbul, I don't know that I really know how to pronounce it for sure. Is it Hurriyet or?
It's Hurriyet Daily News. Hurriyet means liberty in Turkish, so
Right.
Hurriyet is a big paper here. Daily News is the English offshoot of that paper, so I write a column for Hurriyet Daily News, which is in English, and Star, which is in Turkish, so I write basically to Turkish society and to an English-speaking audience who's interested in Turkish affairs. So that's my basic job.
Okay, and you're also the author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. And I want to talk about that book toward the end of our conversation.
Sure.
But first I wanted to talk about a couple of really big developments in Turkey, I think. One is a possible rapprochement with Israel in the wake of Prime Minister Netanyahu's apology to Prime Minister Erdogan about the killings of Turks during the Gaza flotilla incident in 2010. And then the other one is the possibility of peace with the Kurdish rebels, which would be a huge deal. Which I'm curious, which of those seems bigger in Turkey? It's probably the Kurdish thing, right?
Well, both are good news, certainly, but I think the Kurdish news is bigger because it can be the end of a civil war of some sort, at least a guerrilla war against the state by a separatist movement, which has killed 40,000 people in the past 30 years. It's a huge conflict.
And the development is, just to review the actual development, the leader of the Kurdish rebels, who is in jail in Turkey, announced that it was time to cease the armed movement, the military conflict, and explore ways that Turkey could accommodate Kurdish needs through, I guess, changes in the law, which were left vague, right? I don't have a very clear idea of what exactly he's getting in return for calling off the war.
Exactly. I mean, the jailed leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, who's in a Turkish prison, a very fortified Turkish prison on an island, since 1999, gave a historic speech to his followers, millions of followers, saying that, well, I am your leader. I initiated this armed struggle for rights and maybe autonomy, other things. But now I realize the time has come to continue our struggle, but in a peaceful way, only on the political level. So I call my guerrillas to leave their arms, gradually leave Turkey first, and then, say farewell to arms, and we should continue as a political movement. Now, that is something akin to, say, Osama bin Laden. Imagine if he wasn't killed by captured, but put in a U.S. prison, making a historic speech to all Al-Qaeda people saying that you should still struggle against U.S. in political means, but never use armed terrorism, violence again.
Right.
Now, that is so big for Turks. And, of course, just in the way, like, if bin Laden did that, if he was alive and something like that happened, I'm not saying Al-Qaeda and PKK are exactly the same things, they're very different. But, Americans would be happy, but also a little suspicious. And they would say, can we really trust this man? Right. That sort of, I'm sure, rhetoric would be there in the U.S. So in Turkey, I think that's the case as well. Many people, especially liberals, who have been defending this kind of peace between the government and these rebels, they're happy that this is happening finally. But other people are saying, can we trust these people if he gets out thanks to this process and if he calls for arms again? So there are those kind of suspicions in the air. So it is a new phase. Not everybody knows all the details. You're correct that Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, he didn't put a detailed program on how to leave weapons, but he gave a paradigmic shift, a talk of a paradigmic shift that people say here, saying that ultimately PKK should stop using violence, using weapons, and continue its struggle as a political movement. In that struggle, there will be demands for autonomy, there will be demands for this and that, not separation. I mean, he made that obvious. So these are things that Turkey can discuss, certainly.
And that's a big change in goals, right? I mean, my assumption, just from the outside and knowing very little about it, is that the goal had been an actual Kurdish state. And that's an aspiration shared by some Kurds, of course, in Syria and in Iraq, this aspiration of a larger Kurdistan that would presumably take territory from a number of states. So this, I gather that had been the goal, and in that sense, this would represent a huge shift if now they're willing to settle for merely an autonomous region within the Turkish state, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Actually, that goal, the goal of creating a grand, unified, independent Kurdistan, as the PKK was saying in the early stages, that remains perhaps as a romantic, distant goal for PKK or other Kurdish nationalists, because PKK and others, like the Barzani forces in Iraqi Kurdistan, even the Syrian Kurds, they understand that, well, that is not really possible, and that's be too bloody, and you can't achieve that, and it's not even good. I mean, a state landlocked in southern Turkey, in the poorest cities of Turkey, which will make the Kurds devoid of Istanbul, Ankara, all the coast and the most beautiful parts of Turkey. That is not even maybe desirable. So that's why the Kurdish political movement in Turkey began as an independence movement, but gradually moved to the idea of an autonomy. And Öcalan even didn't mention autonomy. He said, our rights, he said, our political struggle, I'm sure autonomy will come up, some form of autonomy. But even he didn't emphasize that. He emphasized that the political struggle should be with non-violent means. Of course, that was welcomed by the state elite and the government, the Turkish government. This doesn't mean the Kurdish issue in Turkey will end overnight. But if he can demilitarize the issue through this call and the upcoming process, that will be a really big victory for the government in Turkey, but actually anybody who wants peace. And maybe even the PKK itself, because it will maybe turn into a more acceptable force.
And it sounds like Kurds in Turkey are by and large happy about this. I mean, I'm sure both the Kurdish rebel leader and Prime Minister Erdogan are facing skeptics on their sides who are saying you've sold out, whatever. But by and large, do Kurds seem happy with this?
There are Kurds and Kurds, of course. I mean, first of all, not all Kurds supported this armed campaign anyway. The PKK, pro-PKK political parties get 5-6% of the votes in every election, but the Kurdish vote is more than 15%. So not all Kurds are nationalists. Many actually voted for Erdogan's party, the party of the Kurds prime minister, because they're already religious conservatives themselves. They sympathize with the government, cultural grounds. So not all Kurds supported this, but the Kurds who supported the PKK campaign, they actually don't want independence, because also Kurds are very integrated to Turkey, more than Iraqi Kurds. The biggest Kurdish city in Turkey is not Diyarbakir, the eastern city out there, but Istanbul. There are so many Kurds who have found jobs in Western cities. They don't necessarily want autonomy, but they want to be honored, because their identity really has been suppressed in Turkey from the beginning because of our very authoritarian assimilationist nationalism. The current government got rid of many of those impositions on the Kurdish culture, but Kurds want to be honored more, and that's why they want changes in the constitution, which will put an end to defining every citizen as Kurd, for example, and some form of autonomy as well for the region. And although there is opposition even to these demands by the Turkish nationalists, I think these are issues that Turkey gradually will be able to solve politically if this process works. But if it doesn't work, if there's a re-escalation of the armed campaign, it will be even harder to come back to a peaceful position again. That's another risk we should point out.
Okay. And what would you expect in the way of next steps? I mean, would you expect Prime Minister Erdogan to make to do some sort of token gesture, let Kurds out of jail? I mean, there are some Kurdish journalists in jail, for example, along with, I guess, some other journalists, and that's been a big issue in Turkey. What would you expect?
Okay, I didn't hear you great, but let me give an answer as I could hear. There are indeed many journalists in Turkey. Most of them are Kurdish activists, and they are in jail. They're sentenced or arrested for writing pro-PKK pieces. Because there's the anti-terrorism law in Turkey, which says terrorist propaganda is a crime. But terrorist propaganda has been so vague that saying that I like the PKK, calling them heroic guerrillas was enough to put you in jail. And that's why most jail journalists in Germany are in jail because of that. But now the government is actually passing a legal reform package which will specify what terrorist propaganda would mean. You would be doing terrorist propaganda if you only venerate the terrorist actions of the terrorist group in question. So that will actually allow many people to go out of jail when this reform passes, and it's expected. So this is actually all in tandem with the political processes. And there are also Kurdish activists arrested for being a part of the PKK network. But it's also expected that the government can pass new laws which will, again, minimize the definition of terrorism. Because until recently, the terrorism law could be implemented by you support terrorism, you're a terrorist. But that could be as easy as marching with the slogans of the PKK or the flag of the group or the poster of the leader of the group, Öcalan. Many people were arrested for these kind of activities. And I think the government they brought a reform package for media issues. But even on the activism issue, I think they will make a refinement, and that will allow some people to be released, which will also bring some, easement to some softening to the issue.
Okay. So this could have implications for Turkey's policies toward, I guess, in principle, both Iraq and Syria. But the Israeli seeming rapprochement could also have implications, in particular, I guess, for the Syrian thing. So why don't we review that first before we talk about Turkey's relations to these other countries? So I guess this was engineered by Obama, right? It had long been demanded by Prime Minister Erdogan that Netanyahu apologize for the killing of these Turks during the Gaza flotilla incident. It had never quite happened, and both countries, I guess, had withdrawn ambassadors, so they basically were not communicating officially. I guess Obama encouraged Netanyahu to finally do this, and Netanyahu figured that he had the political space to do it domestically. Was this hailed as a very big deal in Turkey?
It was. First of all, before getting to Israel, let me also just say one more thing about the Kurds. Mm-hmm. Turkey's policy change towards the Kurds is not only related with the PKK. Turkey has also made a friend with the Iraqi Kurds, Iraqi Kurdistan. The same effort is going with Syrian Kurds. So Turkey, which has seen Kurdish identity as a threat for decades, is not actually trying to make Kurds a friend of Turkey all across the region. In that sense, it's a really big paradigmic shift, as we say here. Just to
so this do you think this clearly will help Turkey's relations with Iraqi and Syrian Kurds? In other words, they won't be disappointed in the Turkish Kurdish movement for kind of selling out. So we expect the Kurdish movements in both Iraq and Syria to be happy with this deal in Turkey. Is that it?
I think they will be. Actually, Iraqi Kurdistan is already supporting this process because Iraqi Kurdistan, as surprisingly as it is in the past 3-4 years, has become an ally of Turkey. Mm-hmm. Now, in Iraq, in northern Iraq, that we call northern Iraq, in Turkey people don't still call Iraqi Kurdistan because of all these fears. But that region, that autonomous region, has become Turkey's best friend. There's so much Turkish investment, and they see Turkey as an ally, especially because of we should add that both countries don't like Iranian policies in Iraq or the Iranian, pro-Iranian central government in Baghdad. So that's another thing. So yes, Iraqi Kurds are particularly already supportive of this process, and I think Syrian Kurds will follow.
Okay, and as for Israel, how was Prime Minister Netanyahu's apology taken in Turkey? I mean, among the Turkish people by and large.
The Israeli apology was certainly welcomed in Turkey by the government, by the supporters of the government, by neutral observers as well. And it was generally seen as a success for the Turkish government that Turkey has been able to get the apology it demands from Israel, even after it came 3 years. Of course, people understand that it mostly came out of Obama's diplomacy and Obama's dialogue with Netanyahu. But also people say, well, Obama didn't ask from Turks to retreat from our demand for apology. Obama asked the Israelis to give that apology. So it means that Obama found the Turkish position right. So that's what people say here. What this will mean, well, of course, the opposition is saying, well, AKP got the apology because they gave concessions here and there. So there are people who criticize it or who were not happy. But generally, the opposition in Turkey generally just doesn't like what the government does. That's what the opposition means. So I can't take that very seriously at this particular junction. So, I mean, government is happy, and I think they feel that they had a diplomatic success in the international arena.
Okay, and what do you think it's going to lead to in various realms? There's two areas you hear about. One is the prospect of, in the realm of the Israel-Palestine issue. I've heard that Erdogan may go visit the West Bank and even Gaza. And then the other thing you hear about is Syria, that Israel and Turkey may now be able to cooperate in confronting the chaos in Syria. Do you think both of those areas actually are going to be impacted significantly?
I think so. And first of all, as you said, diplomatic relations will be restored, so ambassadors will be back in these two countries, so there will be a more regular dialogue, a diplomatic dialogue, cooperation. Second, well, what this will lead to, well, as you said, Turkey has already a leverage in Palestinian territories, particularly on Hamas. Turkey has prestige. And although this Hamas connection made the Israelis nervous to an extent, Turkey has been using this prestige on Hamas to moderate Hamas, to tell Hamas not to attack Israel anymore and allow the peace process and even join the peace process. So I doubt Turkey's leverage on Hamas will be used more effectively because Turkey now will be speaking to Israel as well. So we might expect a Hamas moderation process with Qatar involved as well, yeah.
But doesn't Israel oppose at all costs the inclusion of Hamas in the peace process? And in that sense, don't they actually fear moderate behavior on Hamas's part in a certain kind of cynical sense? Because I think they just very much don't want Gaza brought into any kind of two-state deal. I mean, isn't that your sense that first of all they...
Well, there are Israelis who think that way too. The no solution is the best solution approach that we had in Turkey to many of our problems that I see also in Israel. But I think there are Israelis who would prefer to have a Hamas which is more moderate and who's more supportive of the peace process. I think it depends. Well, I'm not sure about the current government, but I think there are different opinions in Israel. Well, even if Israel doesn't want it, I want it, and I think Turkey wants it. And well, if Israel will be unhappy to see a moderate Hamas, well, then it's Israel's problem. I mean, for the rest of us, for the world, for who wants peace, and even for the Israelis who want peace, I think it's a good thing. So I would suspect that would be Turkey's effort, in Palestinian territories. So because go ahead.
So you expect Hamas to become more moderate, possibly under increased Turkish influence, and more openly eager to join any negotiations involving a two-state solution, which I think is the part that Israel fears, Hamas's involvement in that. Because
I wouldn't expect Hamas to be too eager, but they might be at least less opposed to the peace process, and might be, come to the point of accepting Israel with some form of a formula that they can accept, a very long-term, like a truce or something, whatever they can call it. And it's not just, of course, Turkey. We should not exaggerate the Turkish role here. There's Qatar. Hamas, moved from Syria to Qatar, which is a big change. I mean, the Hamas movement basically moved from the Iranian axis to what we call the moderate Sunni axis, which is Saudi, Qatar, in this case, Turkey. Turkey is different from these countries, obviously, certainly less religious, obviously, as a government. But Turkey is in the same line when it comes to supporting the opposition in Syria and also supporting a two-state solution as a peace formula in the Middle East, not a Israel-less solution, as Iran seems to advocate. And if I were an Israeli hawk, maybe I would be concerned about this. But if I were an Israeli doe who wants peace on a two-state solution, a fair two-state solution, I would be happy to see that. Of course, some people prefer their enemies to be more hawkish because it justifies their own hawkishness. That's a fact of life. We have that in Turkey too. That's why some people prefer the PKK in arms, than as a political force in Turkey. We have that approach too. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that in Israel as well.
Okay.
And also, with Israel, there are also speculations in Turkey that Turkey and Israel maybe can cooperate about energy issues in the East Mediterranean. There's a lot of energy resources to be tapped, and It was always an issue that Israel will do it with South Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus. But Cyprus is in an economic crisis. Maybe Turkey can do that with Israel. So there might be other areas. Of course, the war in Syria, which is a big concern for two countries which have borders to Syria, is a concern. And no matter what we think about the nature of the war in Syria, it can come to a very dangerous level, which will threaten every country around it. And in that sense, it's good to have Israel and Turkey, countries with advanced technology and defense and who are democracies, to have a connection on what can be done about Syria together.
Right. So do you expect to see anything tangible there in the near term? Turkey is already, let's kind of be clear. Turkey, I gather, is already providing arms to the rebels, is certainly involved in the provision of arms to the rebels, right?
Well, Turkish government doesn't accept it. Turkish government says they only support, they only host the civilians, refugees, which is obviously true. And there are 200,000 refugees at least. But although Turkish government doesn't confirm it, many independent news sources argue that Turkey either sends arms, or Turkey allows Saudi or Qatar, even U.S. orchestrated arms to go to some certain groups in Syria, particularly the Free Syrian Army, of course.
Right. And there's no doubt where Turkey's sympathies lie. I mean,
Turkey supports the Syrian
opposition. They support the rebels.
Yeah, Turkey supports the rebels. Turkey hopes that they will win, and there will be a post-Assad Syria. Turkey doesn't want it to turn into a bloodbath, but in a way that the international community supported the rebels against Gaddafi. Turkey hopes that there will be a post-Assad, like a post-Gaddafi, post-Assad Syria, like a post-Gaddafi Libya. But that hasn't happened yet because of the lack of international intervention, unlike the case in Libya. And Turkey by itself cannot go into Syria and change the regime. So Turkey is only giving opposition strong support diplomatically, politically, logistically, and some people say, and there's credible reasons to believe that, probably some arms as well to the Syrian opposition. And Turkey is also lobbying for the Syrian opposition to get more arms openly by the international community.
Is there concern in Turkey, as there is in America, about the most radical Islamist rebels either prevailing or at least getting a hold of a lot of arms? I think that's one thing that has held up deeper American involvement, although American involvement seems to be deepening. Is this fear that weapons will wind up in the hands of true jihadists? I mean, I assume that the Turkish government wouldn't welcome a whole lot of weapons in the hands of true jihadists. I mean, some people consider the Turkish government to have Islamist leanings, but that's not the same as jihadist leanings, obviously. What is the attitude in Turkey?
Turkish government, I don't think that they would be happy to see the Salafi jihadists, Al-Qaeda type people in Syria. The existence of those people are obviously there, and Turkish government, I know, is concerned. And there are reports that they are careful not the arms to go to those groups, and they wanted the arms to go to the Free Syrian Army, the more legitimate, mainstream Syrian opposition. But I think Turkey is also less concerned about those jihadis for a few reasons. There's a prevalent view among government circles in Turkey that element is there, but also it's a bit exaggerated by a pro-Assad propaganda. So the Assad regime uses it as a propaganda, so they think it's exaggerated. And secondly, they think the jihadis are there, maybe just a few hundred people, maybe a little more. But, I mean, if they're crazy to fight, let them fight. But ultimately, they are not the ones who will rule Syria after the revolution. So they will be very marginal groups. There were some jihadis who joined the Bosnian War. There were a few hundred people. I mean, they don't rule over Bosnia right now, obviously. So they see that problem. They don't support the jihadis, but also they think that the problem is not as big as maybe some people think. And they see a propaganda going there by the Iranians, by the Russians, and whoever the friends of Assad regime are.
One thing that I think may confuse America, I mean, Americans tend to not see the distinction between jihadists and mere Islamists. And I think one thing that's confusing is that there are a lot of different rebel groups in Syria, and a number of them have religious names, like grandsons of the Prophet or guardians, the shield of Muhammad, names like that. I don't know if those are the exact names.
Yeah.
And I assume that that having those kinds of names doesn't mean they're jihadist, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's a very vague term. I mean, if you're a Syrian Muslim who's being bombed to death and your kids have been killed by the regime, and you fight, you say God is great, that's
Right.
your spirit. I mean, that is not a terroristic, campaign. That's not Al-Qaeda necessarily. So we should be able to distinguish between that and the jihadists that you're mentioning, which are really, these are only interested in finding conflicts in the world and going fight against the infidels, whoever they are. And they can, well, they fight against the Syrian regime today. They can go and fight against innocent civilians somewhere else today. So that's a matter of concern. But it doesn't mean that any fighter in Syria who's inspired by God and takes, some courage from his belief is necessarily I mean, I asked this question to the very leader of the Syrian opposition, Sheikh Muaz. He's himself a Sunni cleric. And you can call him an Islamist in the sense that he's a faithful Muslim, but he's certainly against all those Al-Qaeda elements. And he said, well, people take inspiration from God. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are those kind of radical ideological jihadis. I think those people are a little group. I mean, one of his Sheikh Muaz's friends were telling me, well, not every man with a beard necessarily is also jihad. These people don't shave, they're in a battle. So I think we should not, and by the way, the emphasis you made, Islamists and jihadis, these are two different concepts. Islamists are people who have a political program, who say, well, we'll come, we will rule the country, and we will have a better regime. I mean, these are Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They're maybe too conservative for many
and they want the regime to be in some sense religious. In other words, they want the law governing the country to be grounded in Islam in some sense. But
in some sense. And again, that can be as horrible as in the Taliban version, but that can be a more moderate and more respectful,
right.
That can be a form of Islamic law that is more respectful to women's rights or religious minorities. You have these different things. It is like the term, imagine this whole political term like the term Marxist. I mean, Khmer Rouge was Marxist. They were so-called the jihadis of that thing. They were just only knew to fight and kill. Well, there were French Marxists who were sitting in cafes and, contemplating about the future of Europe. So it's such a big spectrum. Political parties inspired by some form of Islam, huge spectrum. And it would be only wrong to think that anybody who gets some inspiration from Islam and is in politics is a, like a dangerous, genocidal, suicidal kind of terrorist person.
And this brings us to your book, Islam Without Extremes, right? I mean, your argument is that, well, you tell me what your argument is. You wrote the book.
Well, Islam Without Extremes, a Muslim Case for Liberty, published by Norton about a year ago. Well, as you said, first of all, in the book, I tried to show all this nuance in Muslim thought. And not just in today, but in the medieval era. I tried to show how different Muslim schools of thought, different schools look at the issues of reason, faith, revelation, freedom, individual freedom. And freedom is a big emphasis I make in the book, because I think those who emphasize Islamic law ultimately come to clash with individual rights in the modern sense on some levels. There's a ban on apostasy, there's a ban on blasphemy. Tunisian girls, facing those issues these days in Tunisia, or like people who made cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. Or there's a tendency to have imposed piety, as I call it, to make people more religious by imposing them to be religious. Mm-hmm. I'm critical of all these elements, and I am saying that, well, actually there are tools within the Islamic tradition to reform these notions. And I show how, for example, in late Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Islamic liberals dealt with these issues and brought some Islamic perspective, which was both religious, but also liberal, and in the sense that it appreciated individual freedom. We need more of that liberal message right now in the Muslim world. And also I think the West needs to see that exists, in the Islamic tradition. And not all thinkers who are inspired by Islam are inherently authoritarian.
Tell me this, for that to happen, I mean, for the more, liberal values to manifest themselves in a Muslim environment. So, for example, for Egypt's government, although Islamist, to be a relatively liberal Islamist government, the people kind of have to want it. I mean, it has to have a certain amount of popular support. What are there things that, say, America can do, that American policy or American foreign policy can do to make people in the Muslim world more receptive to more liberal interpretations of Islam? Or put it another way, are there parts of American policy that have complicated that agenda?
Well, America cannot change how Muslims will perceive Islam, and America should not try to do that, and if it tries, it won't help. That's one thing. But America can help build the political context in which more moderate or liberal interpretations of Islam will develop. There was a time that America did not help this context because, for example, American foreign policy was based on supporting secular dictators in the Middle East, like Mubarak, like the Tunisian regime. Luckily, that era has largely ended because America supports democracy movements, democracy, which even if it brings Muslim Brotherhood to power in Egypt, U.S. seems to support that, so that's a good start. So no problem with that. So I don't really find a big problem in mainstream American foreign policy vision today, especially with regards to the Obama administration. They should do something with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is not directly about Islamic theology, not directly about reform or change in Islam, but it always, the Palestinian issue has become an iconic issue which motivates radical movements generally in the Muslim world and gives the sense that the world order is not fair to Muslims. So the world order should change. So we should do something about it, and it can lead to some violent activism as well. But I think, we don't need America to come and reform, and Americans can't do that. Well, they're American Muslim thinkers. I appreciate them. They have important contributions. But they should also, one thing, in the 20th century, the Muslim world, on the one hand, struggled to change. There has been efforts for liberal reform. But these were always curbed by the feeling that the Muslim world is under threat. A political threat, a military threat, Western domination, Western cultural domination, political domination, Israel, this and that. So the more we minimize that perception of threats in Muslim societies, the more we will have an environment in which people will feel more secure and maybe more open. And one more thing, support the market economy, help raise middle class, because change in Islam will also come partly thanks to the social change. The fact that in Turkey we have a more liberal approach to Islam is very much linked to the fact that we have a rising, booming Islamic middle class, which is pious but also more individualistic than their fathers, and who are, looking at religion from a certainly more individualistic and reinterpretive perspective.
Now you're talking about Turkey now?
Well, yes. Turkey is an interesting country. It was not related with lots of issues in Islam throughout the 20th century because our leaders had said we have nothing to do with Islam. We are a secular government, not just a secular government, but a secular society as well.
Right.
But it was an authoritarian secularism, which really actually didn't help liberty in Turkey.
Right. But the rise of the current government, of the current more religious government, which has alarmed some secular people in Turkey, I gather has been based largely on support from this kind of growing Muslim middle class, right? The kind of newly relatively affluent Muslims. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a perfect assessment. The current government, the AKP, Justice and Development Party, government of Erdogan in Turkey, which has 50% of the votes right now, it's a very successful government. And it is in power not only because it's Islamic leaning or conservative, it's in power because it's very successful in terms of the economy and basically modernizing Turkey in a very technical sense. They get a lot of support from this rising middle class, pious, religious, but also entrepreneurial, but also cosmopolitan, but also more global than their forefathers. Right. There was actually interesting, a Western think tank prepared a report about the new Muslim culture in Turkey, and they use the term Islamic Calvinists, referring to Max Weber and his theory of early Protestants and its effect in capitalism in Europe.
Right.
They say such a work ethic is developing in Turkey, and these Islamic Calvinists, meaning the pious Muslim entrepreneurial businessman, they are certainly politically moderate. And even on religious issues, they're getting more moderate and more liberal. And because they said they think more individualistic terms rather than the more communitarian terms, which was more definitive in the past.
Right. So do you think fears of religious influence on government, these fears on the part of relatively secular Turks, are overblown?
I think it's overblown. Well, there are reasons today to be concerned sometimes by some of the policies of the government. Like freedom of the press, we should acknowledge that it's not great in Turkey. It has never been this great, but it's not great today, too. There are problems. But these problems come not from the Islamic identity or nature of the ideology of the government. It's just Turkey's endemic problems. The government, central government is so strong, businessmen and everybody gets state contracts. Media owners are, also a part of this process. So media tends to venerate whoever is in power in Turkey. There are problems like that. But in terms of Islam, religion, public life, I think Turkey has come to a good consensus. Today, it's become a national consensus in Turkey that if you want to wear a headscarf, wear it. If you want to wear a miniskirt, wear it. And it's not the government business to design this, to put people into shapes and forms. Yeah. Today in Turkey, you can go to a bar, you can go to a mosque, and that's what Turkey is. And I think that free choice has kept Turkey religious. I mean, necessarily not everybody in Turkey became secular. I tell my friends, Turkish society is not less religious than the Iranian society, although Iran is supposedly an Islamic state. Turkey is a secular state. But in that secular state, in that freedom environment, Turkish pious Muslims have remained pious and created important civil society movements. Yeah. That's why I argue in my book, Islam Without Extremism, the Muslim Case for Liberty, freedom is the basis on which you have Islam and Islamic movements, not authoritarianism, which, unfortunately, not everybody gets that in the Middle East. But I think that's a lesson from a Turkish experience.
Mm-hmm. Now, it strikes me that Turkey is, it's a very important country now, but it is potentially a hugely important country because, partly because of its mere geographic positioning, but also because of its historic heritage and its cultural composition. I mean, it is a secular state and a relatively secular Muslim country and a modern country, and parts of it feel very European when you're there. And of course, it's positioned kind of as a natural bridge between Europe and the Middle East, and in some sense between the West and the Muslim world. I gather is there a sense in Turkey that Turkey has potentially this great destiny to be a benign and stabilizing force in the world?
Well, that's what Turks hope that Turkey will become. Especially conservative Turks, people who think like Prime Minister Erdogan. Mm-hmm. They have a sense of Turkey's historic mission. Mm-hmm. I call it the belief in Turkey's manifest destiny. That, Turkey as a central, nation, a country in the Muslim world, will be a leader of some sort of a leader in the Muslim world again, at least a central country, because Huntington was complaining that there's no central country, a core country in the Muslim civilization. Not in the sense of, leading all Muslims against the West or something, but with its own experience from Westernization, with democracy, the market economy, with individual rights, with this whole synthesis that Turkey has between the Muslim identity and liberal democracy of the West, Turkey hopes to become a beacon, an iconic country. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's far-fetched, maybe that's never going to happen, but it is also fair to say, well, Turkey has achieved something in the past decade, and it's a country that many Muslims look up to, at least as a source of inspiration. Its synthesis of Islam and modernity is attracting a lot of attention. Turkish soap operas are booming in the Middle East. Turkish political prestige is out there. So we shouldn't exaggerate it, I think, as Turks. I think we shouldn't be arrogant about this. Mm-hmm. But also, it's fair to say, yes, Turkey is becoming an interesting country which can present a Muslim form of modernity, as I call it. Mm-hmm. Not an exact imitation of the West, but a Muslim form of modernity with democracy, the market economy, individual rights, with some nuances, cultural nuances, of course. I mean, even U.S. and Amsterdam are not the same. There are some cultural differences, and so there will be cultural differences between different modernities. Mm-hmm. But I'm hopeful in the potential of Turkey to exemplify that for the rest of the Muslim world in the 21st century.
Okay. And finally, let me just ask you a question I often ask people on Worldwise when they're when they're not in America is how is America viewed in Turkey, if it's not too hard to generalize about that?
Big question. Well, America was very popular in Turkey right until the 2000s. I mean, Clinton was very popular, the whole 90s. Because, well, first of all, during the Cold War era, America was again popular. It was our savior from godless communism, the Soviet expansion. In the 90s, America was a savior of the Bosnian Muslims or Albanians, which Turkey loved and sympathized with a lot. With the Iraq War, everything got shattered. And America has started to become perceived as a imperialist power in the Middle East. And Turkey also got double threatened by the Iraq War because of the Kurdish element there. Turkish nationalists especially got obsessed with American plans about a Kurdish state. It's funny that we are now, closer than Iraqi Kurdistan America is. This shows how things have changed. So the Iraq War, the Bush era, the Guantanamo, black sites, all that, unhappy, pleasant stories during the Bush era, that really shattered U.S. image a lot. With Obama, the image has restored to some extent, but we need more dialogue. And generally, though, I should say this: even when we speak of anti-Americanism in Turkey, which is still out there, I shouldn't deny it. But it is something about U.S. government and people and the policies of the U.S. government, real or imagined. Imagined conspiracies by the government. It's not about American people. I mean, an American comes to walks in Turkey. I mean, she or she will find friendly people. Mm-hmm. But in political terms, conspiracy theories are quite popular in Turkey. People believe in all sorts of conspiracy theories, and America is always in those conspiracy theories of some sort. And America gets a share of that, I think, national paranoia in Turkey that we have in many political issues.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but it's not as bad as right after the Iraq War.
In some measure.
Yeah.
So listen. Well, thank you so much, Mustafa, for illuminating these recent developments.
My pleasure, Robert.
That I think are auspicious. And I hope they play out that way. I hope you'll come back and join us down the road to maybe analyze their implications and their ramifications.
Definitely, I would love that.
Okay.
Definitely, I would love to meet you in person.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Okay, good.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.